In this video, I want to talk about NASA's cuts to the Space Launch System budget and the stage's workforce. If we dig into the weeds, we can see and hear how a change in Congress led to a sequence of decisions that brought about that result. So let's go beyond the sound bites. Hey everyone, it's late April, early May 2024, and NASA leadership just went over the current status of the Artemis programs on Friday, April 26th. There's a lot of detail in those, and we'll go over those in some future videos, but on the same day, the first SLS layoffs from the Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans were also announced. And what I want to do in this video is talk about how changes to the budget led to those SLS cuts. Eric Berger with Ars Technica reported the restructuring of Boeing's SLS program a little over a week ago, and I went through that in a previous video that I'm linking above. That workforce reduction process is getting started and may not be over for a little while. NASA's budget for the current fiscal year was finally passed last month in March, and at the time I went over the budget crunch for some of the Artemis programs created by spending caps. After the SLS cuts were reported in the story, media folks like me asked for an official response, and a statement was provided to me by NASA Public Affairs. It says, quote, NASA's SLS, Space Launch System, rocket is a key component of the agency's Artemis campaign. NASA and its industry partners continuously work together to evaluate and align budget, resources, and schedules to execute mission requirements efficiently, safely, and successfully in support of NASA's Moon to Mars goals and objectives. Unquote. The statement sounds like the agency doesn't want to talk about the actions or the reasons because it doesn't directly address what they did or why they did it. But subsequent to the release of this statement on April 23rd, in one of the overviews that NASA leadership made to the NASA Advisory Council on April 26th, they helped explain what changed with this budget and how NASA now has more control over the exploration budget, which led to the SLS cuts. The space agency has not said which other Artemis program or programs would get money taken from SLS, but this is a significant change and is something else to keep an eye on, especially if this change is a long-term one. Leadership with NASA's Exploration Systems Development Mission Directorate and Moon to Mars Program Office briefed the Human Exploration Committee of the NASA Advisory Council on Friday, April 26th at NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. Specific to this video, there was a presentation by Brian Dewhurst. As the title slide says, Mr. Dewhurst is the director of the Budget Office for ESDMD. And there was this explanation of the change in the fiscal year 2024 appropriations that was passed by Congress and signed into law by the President in March.
Those of you who have been tracking budgets and appropriations may know that ever since the end of Constellation, the Orion program, the Space Launch System program, and the Exploration Ground Systems program have each had appropriations in the law, right, where it's not been the committee's recommendation, it's been actual law that $2.6 billion go to the Space Launch System. We have worked, and especially now with the establishment of the Moon to Mars Program Office, to not have those numbers in the law. Having those numbers in the law has some technical budget limitations that limit our flexibility as we execute. And having program by program numbers in law really would make Amit's life difficult as he goes to apply resources to emerging risks and to risk balance in the year of execution across the entire Moon to Mars program. We were pleased the committees heard us and helped us. And this year, the numbers that you see in italics are not in law. They are in the report. So they are the committee's recommendations. And we take those seriously, but they do not have the legal limitations that they have had for the past decade plus. And so we appreciate that from the committees, but also see it as recognition of their support for the Moon to Mars Program Office and the work that Amit's doing and his team.
So Congress used to slice the exploration budget pie before they delivered it, controlling exactly how little and how much NASA had to spend on their priorities. Now they have given that spending control to the executive branch of government and NASA specifically. This explanation also helps to confirm that Congress had granted that budget authority to NASA, and also that this authority was something that NASA had desired for a while. One of the most conspicuous changes in the overall budget process in the past year is the retirement of Alabama Senator Richard Shelby, who had sat on the Appropriations Committee for a long time, almost 30 years, and was the ranking Republican on NASA-related subcommittees and/or the Appropriations Committee as a whole throughout this most recent era of NASA human spaceflight exploration efforts. Also, as noted in previous videos, both the Obama and Trump White Houses opposed SLS and Orion to one degree or another through those administrations. So there are multiple ways to look at this change. The current Biden White House was the first in a while not to make any major changes to the NASA policy of its predecessor. Here's what the language looked like in the past. This is the fiscal year 2023 appropriations. As noted, the law says, quote, not less than, unquote, these amounts are to be spent on these programs. This was consistently the case for SLS and Orion and provided a floor to their budgets. NASA must spend at least this much. This was also typically the case within the SLS number for exploration upper stage. You can see that not less than $600 million must be spent on that. Funding for exploration ground systems was often specified, but within that amount, for example, the number for Mobile Launcher 2 was expressed as, quote-unquote, up to that amount, which is more of a ceiling, or, as Mr. Dewhurst said, it's a recommendation or guideline versus a hard and fast rule. I was just talking about this in the last video on part of the history of the SLS core stage green run. Here's the law for fiscal year 2020. You can see the same rules for spending, setting a floor on the amounts for SLS and Orion and also EUS, given that the Trump White House at the time was on the record saying EUS should be defunded. Here's the relevant text of the fiscal year 2024 minibus, the appropriations. You can see that the only amount specified is the top line for exploration. In the video I did at the time, I remarked about the absence of the text about the SLS lift capability, but the explanation in the meeting on April 26th confirms how important the absence of spending directives is. Mr. Dewhurst also referred to the report that accompanies the appropriations bill. That also carries authority, and that is where the recommended numbers are. The minibus became Public Law 118-42, but we're still waiting for the official copy. What we have is a copy of the report that was passed by Congress, and here's the relevant part of that. As Mr. Dewhurst said, the amounts for SLS and Orion are expressed as up to numbers, which means that NASA, as a part of the executive branch, could spend anywhere up to those amounts, but does not have to spend the full amount. NASA has the authority and the flexibility to decide that, as Mr. Dewhurst also noted. So what this means is that NASA has changed its operating plan for SLS based on the Artemis manifest and the budget caps and cuts. NASA has control over how to slice the exploration budget pie now, and SLS is getting a smaller slice. NASA did not elaborate on how the money is being divided within the Artemis Moon to Mars programs, but the depth of the workforce cuts to SLS reported in the story last week certainly suggests a significant reduction of money. As noted earlier, the statement provided to media on April 23rd provides very little explanation or elaboration on what that new alignment of funding is. It does not say how the budget is distributed, and it does not provide a master schedule that reflects the new distribution of resources. There are definitely other programs and priorities within ESDMD. Going back to the slide, it has a list of priorities, presumably in order from highest to lowest. The priorities shown here also seem to reflect the priorities from Congress in the Appropriations Bill report. It seemed like Artemis 2 and 3 were a higher priority than Artemis 4 and beyond, and that's reflected in this priority list. This list, though, notes that NASA would like to avoid a long gap between Artemis 3 and 4, no more than 2 years, but Mr. Dewhurst noted that some of these goals have more technical constraints than money constraints. And unfortunately, one way to shorten the gap between Artemis 3 and 4 is to just delay Artemis 3 further, which might create a longer gap between Artemis 2 and 3. We can see how these priorities might be in conflict, at least to some extent, since the highest priority in the list is to maintain the Artemis 2 and 3 dates. If that's a higher priority than the goal of no more than 2 years between Artemis 3 and 4, it suggests that NASA would rather fly Artemis 3 sooner and closer to Artemis 2, even if that means a longer gap until Artemis 4. Which brings us back to the technical constraints, which are a bigger factor in the Artemis 3 schedule today than the budget constraints. What effects these cuts will have on SLS stages specifically and the SLS program in general are not clear. Without more details, it's hard to know whether other elements were cut. And even if other elements weren't necessarily cut, they may still have had their schedules stretched out. As it stands, the goal of flying an Artemis mission once a year is now clearly delayed until the next decade. There was already a shortage of SLS vehicles in production. Lockheed Martin is building Orion spacecraft in lots of 3. They are doing block buys of spacecraft hardware for Artemis 3, 4, and 5, and were authorized back in 2022 to do the same for Artemis 6, 7, and 8. Right now, Boeing only has the stages for Artemis 3 and 4 in major production. Materials for the Artemis 5 and 6 stages were ordered, but the authority for production of those stages is not as clearly defined, because the contract for SLS stages is not fully defined itself. It's been less than 18 months since Boeing announced the expansion of core stage production to a second site at the Kennedy Space Center. At the time, they also said they were hiring more people in Louisiana, presumably to increase production at Michoud Assembly Facility. The cuts to SLS stages mean that NASA sees needs for that money elsewhere within Artemis, but the cuts also suggest that the shortage of SLS vehicles will last through the rest of this decade and into the next one. With the SLS stages contractor workforce now being reduced, one of the questions is whether the production schedule will stay the same, improve, or get worse. There's also the questions about the upcoming transition of SLS contracts from a government-owned contractor-operated model to a commercial-owned service that the government uses. That transition was planned to coincide with future production of most of the Artemis 5 hardware, which would be operated by a joint venture known as Deep Space Transport. Boeing is half of the joint venture along with Northrop Grumman to assume all SLS responsibilities at the end of the transition. A reduction of the government's funding burden was part of the plan during and after this transition, but it's not clear what the status of contract negotiations are or whether starting those reductions to SLS stages now will impact short-term negotiations or long-term planning. Thanks for watching. Click on the like button if you found this video informative. As with many of these things, they are storylines or narratives that won't be going away anytime soon. I'm sure these will come up again before too long.